Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, July 29th, 2019. Time for yet another week of shows, and time for yet another show under the cloud of a mass shooting. So, you know, it's America. That's kind of where we are these days. And going to be a difficult weekend to come out of. Hasn't been a great time this weekend, certainly. Everyone... I mean, I don't know. I think we've now reached the point where it's sort of like, oh yeah, mass shooting. Right, check. Almost forgot about that one. And this one, everyone by now, I'm sure, has heard. Gilroy, California, that urban hellhole of Gilroy, California, I guess. And at a garlic festival of all places. And the first video out of the live video out of the situation includes the commentary of who shoots up a garlic festival. Who indeed? It's a unique choice among the many that have been chosen for venues for mass shootings. Of course, one of those gun-free garlic festivals you hear so much about. We'll be hearing any moment, I'm sure, if not already, about how if people had been armed, they would have been able to spray the crowd from the other direction with gunfire. I haven't seen much in the way of news write-ups about the end of the shooting, but I understand that police ended up shooting down a gunman, and another one of those situations where, once again, gunman found in possession of an assault-type rifle, and we'll go through another round of people arguing over whether or not AR-15s really are assault rifles, whether there is such a thing, who made up the name, and of course, one of the, just to throw a little levity into the middle of a mass shooting. One of the longest ongoing anti-gun trolls going on out there. People who intentionally go on the air and say, of course there are such things as assault rifles. The AR in AR-15 stands for assault rifle, knowing full well that it doesn't, but that it drives gun people up the wall, and it usually keeps them occupied for weeks at a time, yelling at this person. And if they're occupied elsewhere, so much the better. All right, so yeah, let's see. The Gilroy shooting, of course, I was going to say another of those incidents in which an assault rifle is involved, and, curiously enough, another of the situations in which eyewitnesses and police suppose, they guess, they warn that there might be another gunman somewhere. There might have been two or more gunmen doing the shooting, but it usually turns out to be the case that no, once again, it's just something that you're able to do by having a semi-automatic weapon that can fire very, very quickly. And it leads people to believe that there must be a second gunman. No, it's one person usually with an off-the-shelf weapon, and that's something to keep in mind here. What have you sent me? Justice has sent me some notes in the background here, I guess, on is this the latest reporting, the latest print reporting on the situation? It appears as though the now deceased suspect came into the festival via the creek, which borders the parking area. They use some kind of tool to cut through the secure fence line. It's the cutting tools that are the big problem in this country. They hijacked airplanes with them. NBC Bay Area spoke to Gilroy Councilwoman Kat Tucker. This according to the San Francisco SF Gate website here. That's the link I've got here. Spoke to Kat Tucker, who confirmed security checked bags and wanded adults entering the festival. They were trying to keep the guns out, but I guess it didn't work because plastic fencing. Okay, that's kind of standard. Anyway, Tucker said it was the first year such measures were taken, in part because of other shootings around the country. So imagine planning that response. Well, we ought to fence the area off and have metal detectors in order to avoid tragedy because of all the shootings around the country. Oh, well, who's going to shoot up a garlic festival? Well, they did it. All right, let me take a look at this fuller article here. Is that, it's still from last night, but updated in the late evening hours, would have been the overnight, early morning hours here on the East Coast. Updated, let's see, 4, it says, are killed, including the suspected gunman in the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting. That's what I had heard. Many outlets going with the convention of reporting 3 dead, and then also the gunman. It's interesting how the different outlets choose to deal with this sort of thing. All right, let's see. So 3 were killed, 15 more injured. Any word on what the hell the guy was doing? Does it matter? I mean, I suppose one day we'd like to find out what this was all about, to the extent we're able to. But well, he won't be able to tell us. We'll have to wait for the manifesto to be discovered. Let's see. Who knows what's worth doing when it comes to filling you in on the details of this. So what's to know? It was a mass shooter. The shooter is dead. This is the number of people killed. This is the number of people injured. And what can I tell you? Lots of people had eyewitness accounts of being shot at, or being next to people who were shot at, or I don't know. I think if you're next to a person who was shot at, you were shot at too. And at this point, standard issue were really there, and it didn't even light up Twitter really all that much, quite honestly. It may have been that it was late in the day, but I think it's getting to the point where it's really about people just kind of becoming numb to this stuff, which is everything we ever feared might happen, and here it is. All right, well, that's our opener, our cold opener for today. Daily Coast Radio is live now, and as you know, Bill starts us off with a morning tweet each day, and it was about this as well. Kagro X, me, David Waldman, wonders if we could maybe wrap the gun makers and Trump into one big impeachment package deal and save on the paperwork. That's a great idea. We ought to get rid of both of them, but we'll only be, our Constitution only contemplates getting rid of one of them, although, you can change the other part too. Although, really, if we're going to change everything, we might as well see if we can get rid of all of this stuff in one sweeping cleanup, if you will. All right, let's see. Other things that we have experienced over the weekend. The horrific and virulent racism of Donald Trump. Of course, we've all heard that story. We can examine various angles on the story, but basically, Trump spent the weekend rage tweeting, and I don't know whether he intended to get into this kind of fight. Lots of people will debate for a long time over whether or not it was strategically done and whether it distracted adequately from whatever it was he was trying to direct our attention away from. Elijah Cummings came in as the target for a racist tirade, and Trump decided he would throw all of Baltimore in there as well, and pretty much, lots of wider communities as well, given the horrific approach he decided to take in launching this attack. Elijah Cummings, of course, chairman of the House Oversight Committee, which has been making great inroads in exposing the various, crimes and other wrongdoings by President Trump personally and his wider so-called administration. And they've been doing so relatively effectively, scoring some victories in court and putting the Congress on a footing to, possibly get a hold of his tax returns, though that is mostly being driven by the Ways and Means Committee, getting his business records from his accountants, and I believe that is the work of the House Oversight Committee. Any number of areas in which they're investigating, of course, and of course, heading into court eventually, to try and enforce subpoenas against administration figures who have thus far refused to testify. So I guess this has gotten under Trump's skin, and he has got a lot of skin to get under, and so it's an easy thing to do. And best guess is that he's just angry that he's angry that he's being investigated. 2, knows very well that the inquiries that have been launched have got him dead to rights. And as he said, as was reported in the Mueller report, he's effed. This is supposed to be the end of his presidency, although he's doing everything he can to prolong things because, as Robert Mueller highlighted for us last week, he faces indictment and perhaps imprisonment after leaving office. And I guess one of the things that needs to be clarified from that episode, by the way, is that it is said, and I haven't checked into it myself and read the statute, but it said that some of the crimes for which he could in fact be indicted post-presidency include some for which the statute of limitations might perhaps be considered to have expired if you were looking to indict him for those crimes at the end of a second term. Of course, many of those activities may yet be ongoing, and that may toll the statute, as they say. That's the term of art, which most of you would... it's a term of art that covers that concept, which most of you would imagine is the case with statutes of limitations, that if you do something to prevent the discovery of the crime, or the crime is ongoing throughout the period, let's say, of your presidency, or anything else, really. But for this particular purpose, we'll be talking about committing crimes while president. And the concept, of course, of tolling the statute of limitations is the one that says, well, everything ought to be put on pause by virtue of your continued criminal activity. You can't continue the activity or cover up the criminal activity and benefit from that by having the statute of limitations expire. That shouldn't be an option that's available to you, and technically, legally speaking, it is not. However, that is a possibility. We'll have arguments about that. So I guess look for the Trump team, should they manage to somehow come into possession, legally speaking, at least as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, of a entitlement to a second term in office. You can look forward to having that fight after Trump's second term expires, if by that point there is such a thing as having your term expire. You know, everything is very speculative these days. You have to take these things step by step. All right. Let's see. Other items for discussion from over the weekend and in and around the weekend as well. Let's see. Also, the resignation, rather sudden, I guess, although everyone's sort of been expecting it, of Dan Coates as Director of National Intelligence. He, by most reports, never a real standout in the job, but it's a hard job to stand out in, I suppose. You're supposed to keep a relatively low profile, but the bigger news is that he will be replaced by maybe the second or third dumbest member of Congress by many people's reckoning, especially given performance in recent hearings. It's not Louis Gohmert, but a close, second or third, I suppose. John Ratcliffe is the guy's name. A relatively inexperienced at everything. Relatively inexperienced in Congress. Certainly inexperienced in intelligence. The main... It sounds like the main, I was going to say qualification, but that's not really the word either. But I guess the main factor recommending him to Donald Trump's attention is that he is as crazy a conspiracy theorist as Trump is in his rage tweeting best, and has been an outspoken defender of Donald Trump during televised hearings. That's how he comes to Donald Trump's attention. And he is a promoter of outlandish right-wing conspiracy theories, which is what makes Trump interested in him. He makes for compelling television when Trump watches / doesn't watch the hearings. I think we cleared that up, by the way. There was the indication given by the president. I guess their first tack last week was to say that Trump was so dismissive of the mission and righteousness, I guess, of the Mueller hearings, both before the Judiciary Committee and the Intelligence Committee, that he was going to punish us all by declaring himself uninterested in their proceedings. He was not going to watch them. But of course, the idea of Trump passing up television that's about Trump is too absurd to be borne. And what do you know? We didn't have to bear it, because he went right ahead and watched it, and later tweeted about how much of it he watched because of how angry he was, and no even an attempt to reconcile the fact that he was now flatly stating that he was glued to the television with his prior statement about that he was not going to watch it. Anyway, while he was watching, I guess he was impressed with the ferocity with which, and it wasn't even really all that ferocious, the ferocity with which John Ratcliffe posited stupid conspiracy theories that would somehow exonerate Trump and implicate Democrats in various crimes. And that was enough, I guess, for him to finally push Dan Coats out of his job as Director of National Intelligence and say that, tell everybody that he was going to be nominating John Ratcliffe. As you know, with Donald Trump, you have to wonder every time whether or not he's actually going to go ahead and do that. There's every indication is that he does plan to nominate Ratcliffe. It's just a question of, has he submitted paperwork? Will he submit paperwork? And will it work? We don't know the answer to any of these things. There is a line of reasoning which tells us that the president is going to have to make this official nomination and follow through with it, because there's some statutory bar to having his own personal choice step in as acting Director of National Intelligence. But as we know, those things don't typically interest Donald Trump or any of the people enforcing the law around him. Let me pick up Hunter's front page coverage just to give some flavor, if you will, to the idiocy of this particular transition in the ODNI's office, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It looks like a dyslexic spelling of Odin, I guess. That's what comes to mind every time I see it. All right. National Intelligence Director will resign. Trump picks conspiracy-promoting loyalist as replacement. Does that sum things up for you, headline-wise? It really almost doesn't even require a reading of the story. However, that's what we do here. Plus, of course, Hunter wrote it up, so it ought to be somewhat entertaining. Another top member of the Trump administration is on his way out. I think it's the 350th cabinet member to resign. National Intelligence Director Dan Coats will be stepping down after a tenure filled with frequent conflict with Trump. The source of that conflict is directly Russia. Trump has been infuriated by Coats' assessment of the severity of Russian election tampering, both in the 2016 presidential election and in ongoing efforts. Coats has, in fact, been one of the most vocal government officials warning of Russian efforts to tamper with United States elections, warnings that frequently put him in direct conflict with Donald Trump's insisted upon White House stance that those Russian efforts are fake news. He also earned Trump's ire with testimony to the Senate that conflicted with false Trump declarations about the Iranian nuclear threat, ISIS, and the North Korean dictatorship. The loss of the most senior Republican figure in the administration willing to push back on Trump's false intelligence claims may have dire consequences. It may. It's treason. It by itself, of course, naming John Ratcliffe to any cabinet position and or this position, neither one by themselves on its face the traditional definition of treason, but in its totality, basically. And there are plenty of Twitter warnings out there. You don't even need to find them, but I understand people are circulating the commentary of a former CIA officer making pretty much the same point that any number of other observers have made. What Donald Trump is doing is firing everyone in the intelligence community that isn't willing to adopt his fever-brained conspiracy theory view of everything in furtherance of, I guess, what journalists and pundits will call flipping the script. In other words, taking the fact that they've been taking direction from Russia, doing everything that they can to cover that up, and so that people don't discover that they are essentially turning over political control of American policy, both foreign and domestic, to either directly to Russia and Russian leadership, or in service of some furtherance of the relationship between the two. And underlying it all, I suppose, is the promise that one day Trump will be made fabulously wealthy by Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs when they seal some sought-after business deal maybe not after, but at some later point out. I think the original design was after Trump leaves office, although I think he's increasingly interested, I'm sure, in nailing that money down while he's in office, because why not? Why wait? No one will impeach him for it, though it is in direct violation of the emoluments clauses of the Constitution and represents a national security threat of the kind that does probably rise to the level of treason, though people will pretend they're too obtuse to understand why and attempt to show you that you can't hammer the facts of this case into the very narrow definition, constitutional definition of treason. But it requires a different kind of understanding, a modern understanding of what is the nature of war and when are we in one and who are our adversaries. If you're not marching in formation on a battlefield somewhere, the antiquated understanding of the term war, then people will just continue to insist that treason is impossible. But we might as well start to get used to saying it. We've gotten ourselves used to saying the I word, oh my God, out in public. So eventually, I guess the next thing we got to work on is normalizing discussion of the T word. And what can I tell you? Individual one has made it a necessity. All right, let me continue with the DNI story before we get too far afield. We left off saying that Coates was, in fact, one of the most outspoken. He was the only one able to bring himself to push back on Trump's lies about Iranian nuclear threat, ISIS, North Korea, etc. The loss of the most senior Republican figure will have dire consequences, especially with regard to the administration's new push toward military conflict with Iran and its insistence that because theories of Russian intelligence interference on behalf of Trump are fake, moves to strengthen U.S. election security are unnecessary. The treason there continuing with the help of Mitch McConnell, of course, and we can talk about that as well. In a tweet, Trump announced his intention to nominate House Republican John Ratcliffe of Texas. Of course, he did it in a tweet because He does not take the presidency seriously enough to do it through official channels, plus that would require paper, and we don't like that. Rather than a no-nonsense intelligence overseer in the Coates model, the hard right Radcliffe has been an animated conspiracy theorist. Lots of links here that we can go along and read some background information about just how crazy he is, and maybe we'll do that after our break. He's been an animated conspiracy theorist who has repeatedly and aggressively worked to promote Trump's own theory that the Russian investigation was undertaken as a democratic effort to undermine Trump rather than as a legitimate investigation into an attack by a foreign adversary. Do you like the adversary pronunciation better than the adversary? I'm just sort of curious about where people break down on that. On Sunday, Ratcliffe again alleged on Fox News that there were crimes committed. That's a quote. Crimes committed by members of the Obama administration in an effort by Democrats to reverse engineer allegations against Trump. But he was vocal in the election year Republican shudder over Hillary Clinton's emails, earning conservative fame for blasting FBI Director James Comey in September of 2016 for his decision not to prosecute Clinton. He is also a promoter of the Republican theory that the FBI's surveillance warrants against Trump campaign figure Carter Page, who moves multiple Russian contracts before, during, and after, I think, the campaign, had alarmed intelligence officials and that they were both improper and themselves criminal. All of that just dismissed out of hand because Republican, essentially, is the real reason why Ratcliffe is doing this. It'd be very interesting to head down the path and read a little bit more about his background. We'll see if we can't organize our thoughts a bit more in the segment upcoming after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Those of you listening in who may not have heard the announcement towards the end of the week and may be wondering, where's Greg Dworkin? Greg Dworkin on vacation. Vacation? Yes, vacation this week and next. That leaves us without our ordinary news roundup. It's going to be very difficult coming back from his 2-week vacation and learning that he has to tell us everything that happened for the past 2 weeks. Who knows what we may miss. And one of the items, as a matter of fact, actually probably is going to cause some difficulty. We'll catch up with the polling, I think, without skipping a beat. Well, if there's one thing we've learned from the polling, it's that everything appears to be likely to remain more or less on an even keel. Which this is a good experiment with 2 weeks about to go by without regular polling updates. Are we going to come back to any sort of shocks in any way? And my guess is probably not. Although there is one event that may intervene that could change all of that, and that is we could find the necessity for a quadruple bypass in Donald Trump is one, but the other one was the Democratic debate coming up this week. And if I recall correctly, because I try to put these things out of my mind, it's the 31st, right? So that's today being the 29th. We're talking about Wednesday. I don't know how they're breaking it up this time. I don't know who goes when or who's on what stage with whom. Many of you have already found that out. I would find it difficult to care about that, but it's going to make a difference, and it's going to make a difference in what we talk about during the second half of the week, probably into next week as well. Lots of discussion out there already, and I guess in preparation for the debate, the Kamala Harris team putting out a number of plans, because plans seem to be a big thing for many of the candidates, number of plans on, some big issues. Healthcare plan on the way out, what would we call it? Education financing, student debt forgiveness plan also now on the table from the Harris camp. And it being primary season, you will have seen by now the usual mix of praise for the wisdom and bravery of the plans, and scorching criticism of their emptiness and foolishness as well, because it's primary season and that's what people do. The people who put out the plan say it's awesome. The people who did not put out the plan but are competing for the top spot, along with the person who did put out the plan, will say, well, they'll have surrogates say that those plans are terrible and empty-headed, but they themselves will likely say, I welcome the entry into the competition in the marketplace of ideas. You know how these things go. All right. Well, we weren't yet done, but I thought I would at least point out that those things were going to happen. And it's probably now a good time to issue a standing invitation to our rotating cast of characters who do come by from time to time. I'll have to check in with Joan and see if she's planning on coming in on Wednesday or not, and we'll make it that much more critical. And we'll always leave the door open to Armando. And then on top of all this, you're all, as usual, all invited to chime in with your own recorded segments. And I think that those are the most convenient probably for you, and that you can produce those at your leisure as opposed to getting up early and calling in. But, if you have a desperate hankering to do this live and on the air, we could probably give that a try too, and just expand our circle a little bit. Anyway, I wanted to get back to Hunter's write-up of the John Ratcliffe story, because I think this is a great launching pad for any number of vectors of inquiry that will keep us busy for the next 2 hours, certainly, but the next 2 weeks possibly as well. There's some pretty serious implications to all of this. Ratcliffe, we left off before the break, is, in other words, first and foremost, a Trump loyalist willing to ignore and mischaracterize intelligence information to achieve pro-Trump ends, Hunter writes, and he's correct. His final audition for the part was a performance during the House hearings with Robert Mueller, in which, in a bizarre chain of assertions, he attacked Mueller for allegedly overstepping his bounds and relaying that his investigation could not, quote, exonerate Trump, a performance that thrilled a watching Trump. That is to say, Trump was thrilled by Ratcliffe excoriating, to the extent that he was able to do this, Mueller by saying, you overstepped your bounds since you won't exonerate. But it was widely discredited as being based on an absurd and false premise to begin with. If there was any doubt that Trump intends the new director of intelligence to be a figure who will undermine rather than support probes of Russian hacking and Trump campaign responses, Politico national security correspondent Natasha Bertrand further reports that Trump's first choice for Coates' post was Congressman Devin Nunes, a figure deeply embroiled in repeated administration and Republican attempts to sabotage the investigation into Russian election tampering outright. Nunes, however, allegedly turned down the job, amazingly enough, and instead seeks to become CIA director after a Trump 2020 win. Again, just hearkening back to the several warnings on the topic, what you're looking at is an entire, sweeping aside the entire intelligence community professionals, the entire community of intelligence community professionals, if you will, and replacing them with Trump sycophants who produce personal television entertainment for the president. When he watches a hearing, they get on and give the clown theories that the rest of the world laughs at, but that Donald Trump thinks makes for compelling television. Once they are firmly in control of the intelligence apparatus, I guess that coupled with the authority the president purports to be giving to the Attorney General, Mr. Barr, and let me make some more notes for myself by way of connecting all of these things at some later point. The more authority that he purports to be giving him to selectively declassify intelligence, the more dangerous this becomes. If you had, for instance, Devin Nunes as CIA director, John Ratcliffe as director of national intelligence, and William Barr able to declassify information and retain classification on other information at his whim, what you have essentially is a formula for putting the government's, putting the state's imprimatur on the conspiracy theory nonsense that Trump loves so much. While the rest of the world, and in fact congressional Republicans who now deny this in service to Donald Trump, have acknowledged for quite some time that the Russians are interfering in elections in the United States and around the world, rather than rooting that out and dealing with it in service to their own accumulation of power and the accumulation of power among Republicans, and Republicans only in this country. They, if you have the entire intelligence community and the Attorney General with his declassification powers committed to selling this fraud, well, it'll get sold. If instead of Russia's interference being untangled and exposed, you would rather claim that it's not Russians doing this, but in fact American Democrats framing Donald Trump and making this all up as they go along. Imagine if the CIA would officially say, yes, we agree that that's the case. Imagine if that person was backed up by the Director of National Intelligence, who likewise said, yeah, it's true that this is all a plot by Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, the Weather Underground, Saul Alinsky, whatever, their usual cast of characters, George Soros, etc. It's all been made up, and the real truth is, once again, we belong in total, outright, obvious political union with Russia under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, just for kicks, and that all of this has been made up by Democrats instead, and here are 12 official channels headed up by people who are as crazy as Donald Trump is, willing to say, yes, we endorse this view, and if you need something as pedestrian as proof, William Barr can simply make it up. For instance, let's say Devin Nunes grabs a crayon and scrawls out that Hillary Clinton did it. By it, we mean I don't know what, but it doesn't make much of a difference. And he says, instead of it being a note he scrawled in crayon himself, it is a dossier that he has been handed from a mysterious, shadowy figure whose name I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. That sort of thing. Oh, we're definitely going to need the dramatic music for that one. But I mean, if a lunatic on the street hands you a note scrawled out in crayon on college-ruled reinforced notebook paper that says Hillary Clinton did it, Hillary Clinton done did it, whatever, however you want, if you want to make it even crazier, and tells you that that's a dossier that he got from a source deep inside, the deep state, because it's so deep, that's how many times you're going to say deep, and that he could tell you who wrote it, and you would lose your mind, but then he'd have to kill you, you would say, yeah, okay, this is a street lunatic and not a real thing. However, what if the person who did it did so. He revealed the information in a suit while on television. As you know, we are very, very susceptible to that in this country. And there's a pretty good chance that even if that were the only measures taken, putting on a suit and putting the person on television who would then wave around this note scrawled in crayon on college-ruled reinforced notebook paper and say it was a sophisticated dossier from an international intelligence source, the fact that the person is on TV and in a suit would probably be good enough to get 40% of America to agree that sophisticated secret documents from a foreign intelligence service had indeed been unearthed, revealing that Hillary Clinton did, in fact, do it. But 40% isn't enough. How do you get to 51%? And I think the plan is not just any person in a suit on television waves this thing around, but that person is backed up by the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General as well. As a matter of fact, yes, we would have to kill you if we told you, if we revealed our sources to you. But as it happens, Donald Trump is your friend. He knows you want to get to the bottom of this mystery. He has personally authorized, the Attorney General of the United States to demonstrate to you documentary proof that this is in fact the dossier prepared by a deep state operative. And what he'll produce for you is another screed drawn out in crayon on college-ruled reinforced notebook paper, or maybe even worse, spiral-bound notebook paper that has been torn out, and it's not even one of those good spiral-bound notebooks that has the perforations near the spiral binding so that you can very neatly trim them off, but a cheap spiral-bound 89-cent notebook that you got in ShopRite, no offense, ShopRite, let's say Food Lion, offense, Food Lion, we never liked you. Anyway, so you're stuck with the crazy ragged edge that comes along with, and you know, it diminishes all of, every time you put your back into writing a serious intelligence dossier backed by the members of international intelligence organizations and the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, as you might know about from having read lots of Empty Wheel. Every time you put one of these things together, you forget, but you remember the last time your work was undermined by the raggedy edge of tearing out the spiral-bound notebook paper piece. Everything on it was true, but the raggedy edge, I think, undid you, right? Well, now, don't worry about that if you're a Republican, because now you'll be able to produce one of those things as Attorney General of the United States, and you'll be able to say, okay, remember, if I tell you the source, I'll have to kill you. Well, this piece of paper says the source is George Soros. He finally turned his back on the Clinton conspiracy, and it wasn't making any money for him. And so he's changed his mind, and George Soros actually officially totally said that. What proof have we got that this is George Soros's handwriting? Well, that is still classified, according to Bill Barr. Sure, I could declassify the document, but then I'd have to kill you. Now, granted, we just went through this, and I told you that I couldn't tell you who was the source of this dossier or I'd have to kill you, but that was the director of national intelligence and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency telling you that. I'm Bill Barr, Attorney General, and I'm telling you, I've legalized telling you so that I don't have to kill you now that you know it's George Soros. But the proof that it's George Soros is still something I would have to kill you for. It's a very neat package they've built for themselves, and you shouldn't make any mistake about how dangerous it really is to have Trump in personal control of what gets the imprimatur of the United States government from the intelligence side on top of everything else. I mean, it's bad enough that he's got the ability to produce that material from the various civilian departments. When the Department of Agriculture says not only is ketchup a vegetable, but so is dioxin, you know, you're stuck with that. I understand that you think that's the case, but I know dioxin is a chemical and not a vegetable, and a highly toxic one at that, and I'm not going to eat it. Well, this official document from the U.S. Department of Agriculture says you will, and that there's a U.S. RDA minimum dosage that your kids need and should get in their school lunch. So, you're going to have difficulty. And of course, think about all of our administrative law and how it's set up and how difficult it's going to be to challenge that, even though everybody knows dioxin is a toxic chemical and not a vegetable, or at least everyone used to know that back in the day. But something happened and blah, blah, blah. I don't know exactly what happened. Something weird went on. I felt dizzy. I woke up, Donald Trump was president, and the guy in a suit on television said, dioxin, it's good for you. You should eat it. As a matter of fact, you're not getting enough. And if you somehow have the presence of mind to go to court and sue to find out either how this happened or to stop it from being implemented, you find you run into all sorts of legal presumptions. Judges who say, it's ridiculous, but my hands are tied. I need you to be able to prove that the decision to make dioxin into a vegetable, to declare dioxin a vegetable, was arbitrary and capricious. And that's, you've got your work cut out for you. Now, you may, in fact, discover that there are emails internally inside of the Department of Agriculture that say, subject, to Secretary of Agriculture. What's our Secretary of Agriculture's name? Is it Sonny Perdue? Is that right? Was that I can't remember anymore. Anyway, from Donald Trump, subject, arbitrary and capricious thing I want you to do. Then maybe you'll be able to find that and win your case. Of course, then you have to look out for the intervention of the Attorney General, who will come into court and say, this is not arbitrary and capricious, though that is the title of the email. 1, we have to kill you for seeing the email. 2, it didn't happen. 3, if it did happen, I want to produce, for the record here, this memo from Donald Trump, signed in his own hand, allegedly, although I won't show you the paperwork and it might not exist, but don't ask me for it. But it's an executive order declaring the words arbitrary and capricious henceforth to mean solid and reasoned. And so every time you succeed in proving something to be arbitrary and capricious, what you're really doing is our work for us, proving that we're totally entitled to do this on a solid and reasoned basis. And there's nothing you can do about it. And if you come up with a different terminology, we'll change that one too. And we'll even show you the documentary evidence that was ordered by Donald Trump before you even tried. We'll post-date this thing, or ante-date this thing, or whatever the terminology would be. I don't know why post-date always comes to mind for that. Anyway, once again, getting far afield, just sort of outlining the capacity for horror that the president is setting up here in putting people who are both crazy and personally loyal to him in positions that our political press is still conditioned to believe more or less without question. Anyway, this is kind of where we are at the moment. With the potential installation of an anti-intelligence conspiracy theorist and hard-right partisan as intelligence director, any plans to either confront Russian hacking attempts or harden U.S. election infrastructure against identical Russian efforts in 2020, or even worse efforts, I would warn you, will likely be dead. The prospect of other top intelligence positions, like the CIA chief, being filled by a man who has gone to even greater lengths to sabotage even the investigation of Russia's acts, is even more dire. That dystopian prospect aside, it is not immediately assured that Ratcliffe will make it through the confirmation process unscathed. While being a contemporary promoter with a long line of implausible and offensive Fox News statements to be picked through will not attract Republican scorn, some may be nonplussed by the lack of experience and dignity that the conspiratorial House Republican would bring to the office. That is a big problem. We're not positive that he's going to be confirmed, although with a Senate Republican majority, it's a pretty good shot. That's all it takes. But it probably concerns more than a few Republican senators even, that his total experience in intelligence matters is about a year and a half, I think I saw, 1 year on the Intelligence Oversight Committee in the House, which is, usually is good training in normal circumstances. Again, where the intelligence community is operating as close to normally as an intelligence community can operate, I suppose. You might think that a couple of years on the oversight would give you a pretty decent shot at understanding how the place works. But one, he hasn't had that much time on the committee, and two, he's spent all of it developing his own theory that appears to be contrary to all established fact and all established understanding of intelligence operations. And that's it. That's all he's got, is this alternative view that it's all an underground plot by Democrats to make Donald Trump look bad, as opposed to the various things that even Republicans used to think it was. I guess here, do I illustrate that background? Do I go back and jump through? Maybe one of the things we'll do during the breaks, I'll take a look at some of these links and see whether they help fill in the blanks. Some of the things that we glossed over because we thought you already knew them, or I thought I already knew them, in Hunter's story might deserve some further reading and discussion. But I guess heading as we are into the next break, I'll follow up on that last comment that even Republicans used to think that they knew what was going on. I want to, just by way of reminder, take you back to early to mid 2017. At the time at which you all will remember the incident, you all, and very many of you remember it for the right reason, because we've talked about this before on the show. And many of you, or many people that you know, likely remember this incident for what I would say is the wrong reason for this particular inquiry. Everybody remembers Kevin McCarthy, now House Republican leader, being caught on tape saying that he thinks that Putin pays both Dana Rohrabacher and, more importantly, Donald Trump. Ha, etc. Keep it a secret. I think I've always thought that the more important part of that taped conversation that we found out about in mid-2017, but which was in fact recorded in mid-2016, before Republicans were officially saddled with Donald Trump as their nominee and then therefore signed their lives over to his defense. More important was the discussion being had among the Republican leaders about what they were learning from the Ukrainian leaders who were visiting with members of Congress in Washington at that time and reporting to them about the lengths to which the Russians were going to interfere in their elections and their domestic governance. And what Republicans thought about that then was that it was an outrage, a danger to Western liberal democracy and the Western way of life. Freedom, independence, and all of the great buzzwords that we love so much were all under threat, and they knew it, though they appear not to have been either interested in or not to have believed that the United States was subject to the same kind of attack. However, when they saw it and heard its effects described by Ukrainians, what had happened in their country, they were appalled. that such a thing could happen, and wanted assurances that the United States was standing as a beacon of freedom against this insidious Russian plot to overcome and to overtake the legitimately elected governments of Western democracies, and how horrific this was and how sophisticated the plan was. And within 6 months or less, once it became clear, one, that Donald Trump was going to be their nominee, and later it became clear that Donald Trump was going to become their president by virtue of Russian interference in our elections, they had to change their minds. And I guess they figured the less painful path there was, we'll just simply deny that it happened in the United States rather than saying it did happen, but it's a good thing. That can be the backup plan. We can always land on that one. But back in mid-2016, the plan was simply not to acknowledge that such a thing could be happening in the United States, despite McCarthy's mistake, I would say, in all of this, which was to acknowledge that not only was such a program underway in the United States, but that the Russians had already captured one prominent member of Congress and the one Republican candidate who was about to lock down their nomination. This is, I think, the last glimpse of an independent wing of the Republican Party inside the Congress of the United States. When we return after this break, I will just remind you of the actual language that was used in describing this situation. And once again, I guess, remind you of the proper level of outrage at our Republican elected officials and exactly how complicit they've become in all of this. And this will remind you of it in case you had forgotten. We'll be right back. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. As I said when we left off, I've set up here, you'll remember, of course, from back in May of 2017, the flashy articles in the Washington Post and elsewhere. House Majority Leader to colleagues in 2016, quote, "I think Putin pays," unquote, Trump. Everyone remembers that part of the exchange. I wanted to read you the transcript. I guess might as well read the full transcript. It's only 5 pages and it's double-spaced and all of that. And most of these people, as I mentioned, these are Republicans having a conversation. So very often the lines are short. Duh, derp, hadoyoyoy, things like that. They do mostly go unsaid in all of this, but it's an easy read, these 5 pages. 5-page transcript of Republicans talking to one another about difficult, complex subjects. That's going to be an easy read. Okay, so here's the transcript of the secretly taped conversation. And let's see, there is at least one unidentified individual in this who leads things off by saying, Kevin, that is Kevin McCarthy, Kevin had the Ukrainian prime minister this morning. Okay, so that's setting the table on this, and there's no sexual innuendo in that. Kevin did not, have the Ukrainian prime minister this morning or any other morning. That is to say, they had a meeting. That is what happened. And that's the subject of discussion here. All right. So Kevin, this unidentified person, probably a staffer of Mr. McCarthy's, Kevin had the Ukrainian prime minister this morning. And here's Paul Ryan. Do you remember Paul Ryan? He was Speaker of the United States House of Representatives at one point. He said, "Oh, so did I. I just left him in the healthcare something unintelligible, in the healthcare murder spree." I don't know what it was that he left him in, but okay, says our unidentified individual. Ryan continues by saying, "This guy's a good guy." Now remember, this is, by the way, this is serious policy wonk Paul Ryan. Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Now, not everything that comes out of the mouth of the current Speaker of the House, not Nancy Pelosi per se. I mean, she is the current Speaker of the House, but whoever the current Speaker of the House is, they're presumed to be a relatively intelligent person, but not everything out of their mouth is going to be, a scholarly dissertation necessarily. But Mr. Serious Wonk is speaking about someone of some importance here, the Prime Minister of Ukraine. Really? What do you make of the guy? He's a good guy. This guy's a good guy. All right, well, that's wanting in some respects. But just in case you didn't hear him, he repeats himself after some crosstalk. This guy's a pretty good guy. So he's upped it a bit. This guy's a good guy. This guy's a pretty good guy. I don't know. Would you say he's raising the stakes, or he's qualifying it and lowering lowering other expectations by saying he's a pretty good guy? It's hard to tell exactly what he means here. Well, anyway, Rogers here, who I think is Kathy McMorris Rogers, Monkey McBean, says, is this the guy who's been there a while? That is this the long-time Ukrainian prime minister who she has in mind for some reason? Ryan says, no, he's new. He was the speaker of the unintelligible. Again, I guess he didn't know the name of the, if there is a special name of the Ukrainian parliament. I don't know it either. Not that, there's anything wrong with Ryan for not knowing it. But okay, he was the speaker of presumably the legislative body there. Now he's the new prime minister. Rogers says their other prime minister got kicked out, right? That's what happens with prime ministers in parliamentary systems sometimes. Ryan says, right, this guy is the anti-corruption guy. And they don't yet know how to feel about that in the Republican Party. It's 2016. That makes them a little squeamish, anti-corruption, because they're sort of into corruption, but it wasn't as full bore as it is now. Now they would just be like, that guy is such a jerk, he's anti-corruption, right? Just as they now say, the new terrorism is anti-fascism, right? Okay, well, this guy who's so good, he's the anti-corruption guy. He's a pretty good guy. This guy's there because he's the anti-corruption guy. He was the speaker. Again, please. And I have the feeling we did this exactly the same way when we read this transcript the first time. We're astonished at how non-wonky and non-intellectual Ryan's discussion is. This guy's a good guy. This guy's a pretty good guy. Is he the old guy? No, he's new. He was the speaker of the place or whatever. The other guy got kicked out, right? Yeah, he's like the anti-corruption guy. This guy's there because he's the anti-corruption guy. He was the speaker, he repeats again after repeating himself again. Rogers says, okay, I heard you the first time. Ryan then says, and he's the one who was working on the amendments to the Constitution, unintelligible, independent judiciary, so that we should have an independent judiciary. Rogers again, okay. Ryan continues by saying, they got that in now, unintelligible, and he's passing all these anti-corruption laws because he's the anti-corruption guy. This guy's anti-corruption. He's a good guy. He's a pretty good guy. He's new. He's the speaker of the unintelligible, right? So Rogers then says, how are things going in Ukraine? What's that? How are things going in Ukraine? He wants things repeated even when he's not the one repeating them. We have the doorbell ringing as well. Somewhere Abby is barking up a storm, but I can't answer this one. Hopefully they'll take the hint and go away and not ring twice. But I guess if it's the postman, there's nothing we can do about it. Okay, sorry. How are things going in Ukraine? Rogers asks Ryan, and Ryan answers. Now at some length. For the first time, he answers at length. Well, the Russians are bombing them. 30, 40 shells a day. And the people, period. That's it. That's the brilliant statement of the Wonk. And the people. Crimea is gone, and they're trying to clean up their government to show that they want to be Western. So what does that mean? Remember, of course, the right-wing folks, the alt-right wing folks in particular, love Western culture, right? Everything Western is superior. So at this point in 2016, Ukraine is Western, and that means good, and we're working with them because they're trying to become more like our Western allies in Western Europe, or maybe even join the European community, which back then we had Republicans in this country who regarded that as a good thing, et cetera, et cetera. But now, of course, Western civilization is awesome, but what we really like is Eastern civilization's idea of how a Western civilization should operate. That is brutal repression, single party rule, physical crackdown on all dissent, and riding horses with your shirt off. Oh, and kissing young boys on the belly. It's not all tough guy stuff. Anyway, so they're bombing them, 30 to 40 shells per day, and the people something. Crimea is gone. Clean up their government to show they want to be Western. So they're trying to prove to the Western world, the good guys, that they want to be Western or Westernizing so that they can get support to get their country back. Back from whom? Back from the Russians. They're unintelligible. Thanks again. Everybody talks a good game on what they're doing, but he, the good guy, the prime minister, passed all these anti-corruption laws. The question is, are they executing? More unintelligible talk. I think by the summer they'll have it all done. It's a pretty good realistic view. And of course everything was backed up, right? We ought to make Paul Ryan the director of national intelligence. Everything is fine. And by the summer of 2016, Ukraine will be westernized and everything will be fine. And they'll have defeated the Russians. It's a couple weeks hence, but they'll do it all in the next few weeks. Rogers asks, did he talk about their economy? Because you know how concerned Republicans are with the economy, ours or theirs. Yeah, says Ryan. This is about getting actual growth and not graft growth. So, no, it's not good, but Rogers. Now we're really starting to get into the heart of things. Now, Rogers is the smarter of the two, apparently, according to this transcript. Anyway, Rogers says, I went there a year ago, Ukraine. It was like, wow, these people are they're on the front lines. They're fighting for their freedom. It's their independence. Ryan answers, he has this really interesting riff, Mr. Good Guy, Mr. Anti-Corruption Guy. He was the Speaker of the Unintelligible. Did you know that? Yes, right. Well, tell us more about what he has. Well, he has this really interesting riff about people have said that they have Ukraine fatigue. I've never heard anybody say that, but okay. People have said they have Ukraine fatigue, but it's really Russian fatigue. Now, this is where it really, like I said, gets amazing because they describe the problem going on in the United States. They just don't know it yet. They say they have Ukraine fatigue, what we would here, I guess, in parallel call Trump-Russia fatigue or Robert Mueller fatigue or, something like that. But it's really Russian fatigue because what Trump-Russia is, I'm sorry, I've jumped the gun here and revealed where we're really going with all this. But people have said, what's actually said here, people have said they have Ukraine fatigue, it's really Russian fatigue because what Russia is doing to us, he says us in this, but he means this is what the Ukrainian prime minister, the good guy, he was the Speaker of the Unintelligible. Do you remember? He's a good guy. He's a pretty good guy. He passed all these anti-corruption laws. In so doing, he is talking about Russia's relationship with Ukraine and Ukraine's relationship with Russia and says, people say they have Ukraine fatigue. It should really be called Russian fatigue because of what Russia is doing to Ukraine, us in the Ukraine. Financing our populists. Wait a minute. They're doing what? Financing our populists? Why, that is
unacceptable!
I agree. Don't get too excited about it. But yes, financing our populists. Sound familiar? They are financing people in our governments to undo our governments. Well, this is easy to believe about Ukraine. They're backwards and stupid. Whereas here in the United States, that could never happen to us because we're forwards and smart. In fact, I'm a huge wonk. Listen to me describe the prime minister of an actual country. He's a pretty good guy. He's a good guy. He's a pretty good guy. He's the Speaker of the Unintelligible. He's anti-corruption because he's passing all these anti-corruption laws. He's a good guy. Pretty good. Anyway, so yes, he's describing what's going on in Ukraine. The Russians are financing our populists, financing people in our governments to undo our governments, messing with our oil and gas energy. That's a big important thing. Well, in a lot of places, but in Ukraine in particular, that was going to be the source of their wealth. That was going to help make them independent. All the things Russia does to basically blow up our country. Again, this is Ukraine. They're just going to roll right through us and then go to the Baltics and everyone else. That's scary, right? That's a big Russian threat to Central and Western Europe. It's the basis of the NATO alliance. It's the fear that the United States has had about the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation since forever, really, but certainly most especially since the end of World War II. And it worries people like Kathy McMorris McRogers McBean, who says yes to all that. Again, Ryan's description of what the Russians are doing: financing our populists, financing people in our governments to undo our governments. Like, let's say, if this wasn't the Ukraine he was talking about, but in fact the United States, he didn't know it, or maybe he did know it, but he's not revealing it. But I think at this point they literally didn't know it. But let's say it's the rough equivalent of, making John Ratcliffe Director of National Intelligence, or Devin Nunes CIA Director, or, for that matter, Wilbur Ross Commerce Secretary, or Alexander Acosta Secretary of Labor, though he's now gone, over and over, people who are all about undoing everything in government, whether they're explicitly pro-Russian in their approach or just anti-everything that the departments they now had were ever supposed to be about. We've gotten used to the idea, like we've gotten used to the idea of mass shootings. We've gotten used to the idea that Republicans will put lobbyists for, the lead smelting industry in charge of the Clean Air Act. We've gotten used to the idea that Republicans will put committed racists in charge of the voting rights section of the Department of Justice. We've gotten used to all that, and I guess what we hadn't yet gotten used to was the idea that a similar program would one day be undertaken for the intelligence community. I guess we thought that Republicans under, say, George W. Bush, that sort of radical Republican, didn't think anything was wrong with the idea of putting committed racists in charge of voting rights activity here in the United States, or putting lobbyists for polluters or for for big pharmaceutical companies in charge of the FDA or something like that, or for that matter in charge of healthcare reform. But we didn't. It no longer surprised us that Republicans were putting opponents of industry regulations in charge of regulating industries on behalf of the government, because I think it was thought, well, how much damage could really be done domestically? There's sure, this is a big problem for growing inequality in the United States economy. It's a big problem for the continued murder of the planet, and that's an international problem. And the polluting we do here doesn't stay here, and it, of course, endangers all life on the planet. But people just generally don't believe that stuff for whatever reason, or don't take it to heart, or at least Republicans certainly don't. And our base so far has been enough. Remember, Karl Rove sort of initiated that plan of, all we need is 50 plus 1, and if we just pander to our base, it should be enough, despite demographic trends. So, this was something that has been with us for a little while. But I think that they all thought that sabotaging domestic policy would only ruin things domestically, so long as we remained more or less traditional on the foreign policy and military and intelligence fronts. World stability would remain, stay less of a problem. Would be less of a problem, would remain less of a problem. We wouldn't have that much to worry about there. It was never a good approach, but it was traditional. I think one of the big differences between the George W. Bush administration and this Trump administration is that they don't take the international aspect of it any more seriously than they do the domestic aspect of things. And that's going to have serious repercussions around the world. Okay. So, back in 2016, I guess they still felt entitled to ignore, or if not ignore, not worry very deeply about what was happening in Ukraine, because that's a backward, stupid European place, Eastern European, not real Europe, Eastern European, as they thought. So that's, that's third world banana republic sort of place, except they can't grow bananas in Ukraine. So instead of bananas, it's oil and gas, and that's all we really care about extracting from the place anyway. And that's their chief source of riches. And so if the government itself suffers because there's so much graft that they can't build a stable government, whose fault is that? It's not. Well, we don't even care. It's not even our problem so long as we get the oil and gas. Of course, your supply of oil and gas is probably best guaranteed by having stable, if authoritarian, government in Ukraine. That's the traditional United States diplomatic approach to these things. Whereas the hands-off, who cares, or so long as production continues and we get it at the lowest possible price, who cares who runs the place, even though it's virtually a guaranteed formula for mobocracy and oligarchy developing in Ukraine, even if you thought that they were naturally inclined to oligarchy or would be forced into it by their close proximity to and relationship with Russia. It was probably avoidable, but I guess this is an interesting overarching point, right? If you are I guess the way they like to dress it up intellectually, a laissez-faire, libertarian, Republican type person, and who cares about regulating? We don't want oil and gas regulated in this country, so we're certainly not going to agree to, if we are in the business of nation building with the Ukraine, we're not going to build in a regulatory bureaucracy there because, one, who cares if the local population is poisoned by poor and careless production methodologies, and two, it keeps prices down and we'll be able to buy that energy off of them for less if we don't, one, saddle them with regulatory burdens, and two, we look the other way when the extraction businesses are staffed by mobsters and oligarchs who, also won't care if their short-term profits suffer because the goal here is to exploit as much of this stuff and sell off as much of it as possible as quickly as possible, because the life of a mobster oligarch, probably the lifespan just isn't that, stable. It's another stability question, right? Grab all the money and all the cash and all the toys you can as quickly as you can because you're likely to be murdered at some point. So best you can do is live it up while you're still alive. And if you're really skilled at this stuff and you grab up enough money, you might be able to build an armed compound for yourself either right there or somewhere overseas that you can escape to when the murder plot is inevitably is hatched and unleashed against you. So there's some laissez-faire capitalism for you at work. We didn't really care to build a stable democracy in Ukraine, but sometimes you have to pay lip service to these things, as they're doing here in this conversation. So Ryan says, continuing his conversation, we should not have Ukraine fatigue. We should have Russian fatigue. Rogers now says, yes, the propaganda. My big takeaway from that trip was just how sophisticated the propaganda, she probably wanted to say was, but she got talked over by Ryan because she's a woman and he's a man. And he said, yes, it's very sophisticated. She continues, the propaganda coming out of Russia and Putin. Yeah, you're describing the problem afflicting the United States. You just didn't know or didn't believe that it was happening right then and there in front of your noses. So, very sophisticated. Some more crosstalk there. Rogers then making a critical point. It's not just Ukraine. They were once funded. Now, this is funny. This is sort of telling also as well. It's not just Ukraine. Now, right there, you're thinking Dave's going to play the dramatic music again. And you're right. I am going to play the dramatic music again. It's not just Ukraine. It's here in the United States. But no, they're not that far seeing. I don't think they recognize that it's happening in the United States. And remember, Trump is not yet the nominee. It was pretty well locked. But at that point, they're still sort of saying, I can't believe it happened, but it happened. As opposed to, oh, Russians may have helped rig this. Anyway, and even still, few people recognize the role that the Russians may have played in the primaries. All would have been for naught had they nominated someone else. I don't think they would have been able to corrupt someone else in exactly the same way. Anyway, so she says, not just Ukraine, bad news. They were once funding the NGOs in Europe. Now, that's a weird thing to follow up. Like, the right answer here is not just Ukraine. It's happening here. Do you realize it? I bet you don't. But no. But instead, she goes to other parts of Europe, which is fine, too, because that is also happening in other parts of Europe, other governments in Europe. But I guess they can't bring themselves to believe that in, what was it, May? It might have been a full year earlier. So, mid 2016. They can't quite bring themselves to believe that it's happening in Ukraine, yes, but also France and also Italy and also Austria, elsewhere. Not only that, but so she's worried about their funding NGOs in Europe, or they're funding major political parties in Europe that then go on to form governments in Europe of supposedly our Western allies in actual, honest to God, Western Europe that people think of as Europe, not those mid-European, Central and Eastern European hellholes that people still think of as the Soviet Union. But to make matters worse, she says, they not only funded NGOs in Europe, they attacked fracking, and that definitely deserves dramatic music. It's unbelievable how frequently I have to go to that sound effect. But they attacked fracking. They were using, I don't know whether they were using the NGOs to do that, but that's the big deal. Remember, the main goal in all of this is we don't care about the political stability of Central and Eastern Europe. We care about access to the gas and oil, and they attacked fracking. That's the biggest infraction, the biggest fault they can find with the Russians. Sure, they're undermining Western democracy, but they're also using their money to attack fracking. So they can't really be on our side, can they? Well, eventually they will be, because we'll come to their side. You'll see how it works. Anyway, they attacked fracking. Ryan says correct. And Rogers goes on to say, Russia TV. I was not, I hadn't tuned in to Russia TV until that trip. It's really frightening. Ryan then goes on to say, so he's, the Ukrainian prime minister, he's saying they're doing this throughout Europe. So, Ryan says this isn't just about Ukraine. Once again, he's on the cusp of getting it. And they talk about it a little more before turning away. Rogers then says, it's unintelligible. It's really a messaging, it's a propaganda war. Ryan says, Russia is trying to turn Ukraine against itself throughout all of this. Just imagine, just take out the word Ukraine and substitute in United States. Works pretty well for a description of our current predicament. Rogers says, yes, and it's sophisticated. Back to that. It's, Ryan, again, you'll remember from when we read this the first time, maniacal. Yes, says Rogers. And guess who's the only one taking a strong stand up against it, says Ryan. And the answer, he says, is we are. Not Ukraine here, but United States is the only one standing up against it. Rogers, though, knows better. We're not. And it's only at that point that, almost with a non sequitur, McCarthy chimes in and says, I'll guarantee, that's in all caps, I'll guarantee you that's what it is. Remember, it's the propaganda is what they're talking about. And then they begin an argument about whether or not the United States is standing up to it, trying to put a stop to it, when we're not, right? But he says, I'll guarantee you that's what it is. The Russians hacked the DNC and got the Oppo research that they had on Trump. This is the part that everybody remembers. McCarthy then laughing and saying and Ryan says, what are you talking about here? The Russians hacked the DNC? McHenry then says, to get Oppo. Ryan says, on Trump. And they delivered it to who? Well, that's the point at which McCarthy finally says, there's two people I think Putin pays, Rohrabacher and Trump. The laughter, the swear to God, the things people remember. But people forget the first half of that conversation. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, and I've just had everything cleared up and then immediately found the frog again. So back into the throat there with that one. So once again, a reminder of how close Republicans came to figuring out what was going on before at the last minute realizing, oh my God, this guy is going to be our nominee and we have to win because we want the tax cut. And then, but after that, whatever we want to do, we are free to, go our own way after that. And of course, they never actually did do that. But anyway, the big reminder there and all that is just, this was I was reminded of the conversation when someone, and I lost track of the Twitter thread in which it happens, but somebody, basically wistfully saying, I remember when Republicans used to be worried about what the Russians were doing as opposed to cooperating with what the Russians were doing. And others said, when were they ever really worried about that? And I was reminded that there was a time, maybe this was the last moment, of even private concern about what Russia was doing before they signed on to the program and, gave away the keys to Trump and Putin. They knew that Trump was under the influence of Vladimir Putin, and they knew that Putin was undermining Western and Western-style democracies throughout Europe, and either convinced themselves that the United States was somehow immune to all that, or finally just put it all aside, for the purposes of accumulating what political power they could under a Trump dictatorship. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting departure point. So some point in April, May, June 2016 was the last remnants of Republicans and their traditional concern with Russia and their penchant for doing what they could at any level to undermine Western democracy. Then they put all of that aside, and now Russia is our friend, as they chanted in the Charlottesville riot situation. Okay, switching over here to other stories. Let's see. There are other things I wanted to link the recitation of these stories to. Let's see. There was, of course, the various things to which Hunter linked, about which I was curious in his story. Let's see. There was the tweet announcing Ratcliffe. Yes. That Ratcliffe was labeled in the story as an animated conspiracy theorist. I was curious about specifically what was his penchant for conspiracy. And I open up this link here to a Splinter News. Interestingly, Splinter News piece. David Bodiger is the author here. Trump wants to replace DNI Dan Coats with a leading Mueller critic. This was a story from yesterday. Let's see. Did they talk about his particular favored conspiracies? It's the mention, of course, of Ratcliffe. This, I guess, before the nomination, I guess what we're calling the nomination was made. Again, remember, none of this was done officially. There was a tweet that said he was going to be nominated. That's all we've got. And once again, I remind you, that's not actually sufficient for nominating a person. And we should probably stop pretending that it is. It just, I guess people are fatigued by the complexity of reminding them that no, just because the president tweeted he was going to nominate him doesn't mean he's been nominated. There's a whole process, and he's skipping over it. But it so far has not mattered in this country for the past 2 to 3 years. So I guess at some level you can hardly blame the political press for not sticking to, not sticking to the necessity for operating according to established procedure, because it just doesn't matter. So maybe they're right. So let's see what they have in this article here by way of describing what Ratcliffe is about. Former federal prosecutor and ex-mayor of Heath, Texas, population 6,900. Nice. There you go. Nice 100. There you go. That's interesting, and it's big time experience, right? Anyway, he was one of a handful of Republican lawmakers who attempted to discredit special counsel Robert Mueller and his report on Russian interference during his testimony before Congress last Wednesday. Of course, his performance earned him a tweet by Donald Trump Jr. and the determination by PolitiFact that he had made a false claim when trying to discredit Mueller. Axios reported on Sunday that Trump is expected to name Ratcliffe, you all know about that, is the next DNI. There's the Trump Jr. tweet here. According to the report in Axios, Trump was thrilled by Ratcliffe's admonishment of Mueller in last week's Judiciary Committee hearing. The special counsel's job, nowhere does it say that you were to conclusively determine Donald Trump's innocence, or that special counsel report should determine whether or not to exonerate him. Ratcliffe, a former prosecutor, said to Mueller. And I don't even know, reading that, what that is supposed to mean. I guess he's trying to discredit Mueller, clearly, but he's like making up claims with, he throws some terminology in there to make it sound like it means something. He's attacking Mueller as having exceeded his mandate by saying, well, nowhere in the documents, establishing your appointment to the position of special counsel, and nowhere in the documentation describing the scope of your investigation does it say that you should conclusively determine whether Donald Trump is innocent or guilty, or whether or not you're exonerating him. Well, but I mean, that's certainly one of the things that kind of goes without saying. If you're having a special counsel investigate somebody, no, it's not their job to reach a conclusion. And he didn't. I mean, you could certainly charge them with the responsibility to reach a conclusion, but maybe here in this instance, the documentation didn't call for it. And you could argue all day about whether or not that was a wise approach to creating the special counsel job here. But even if the documents did explicitly say you're not supposed to reach a charging conclusion about the president, and you're not supposed to exonerate him or not exonerate him. Well, he didn't do that. All he did was he said, well, honestly, even if the documents had said, at all costs, avoid making a determination about the exoneration of the president. All Mueller has said from the beginning is, well, the president says we totally exonerated him. But as you just said, it was not within my purview to exonerate or not exonerate him. So I have not done that. Ratcliffe actually makes that point back to him, and Trump, in his stupor, thinks that's a great point and makes him Director of National Intelligence, which is a huge joke. Then I guess here comes the Donald Trump Jr. tweet is now embedded in the story, in which he says, Representative John Ratcliffe, a former federal prosecutor, brings the heat and shows everyone watching what a disgrace this whole, quote, investigation was. He says it's worth the watch. I suppose that it probably is not, although I'm curious about how long the clip is. So I'm going to press the button here. 4.5 minutes. We can't just play through that, but I encourage you to take a look at what he did with his 5 minutes in the hearing and how it somehow vaulted him to the top of the list for Director of National Intelligence. Anyway, Splinter News goes on here to say the problem with the line of questioning, according to PolitiFact, is that it's wrong. Ratcliffe seems to be taking a page out of Attorney General William Barr's playbook, as in, it may be wrong, but who cares? Quote, Mueller was offering evidence that could be used if the Attorney General did, in fact, decide to charge him. Rick Simmons of Ohio State University's College of Law told PolitiFact, not only is that not barred, it is precisely the kind of evidence that Mueller would be expected to bring to give proper advice to the Attorney General. Ratcliffe also is a frequent guest on Fox News. After Mueller's testimony, he told the network that, quote, the impeachment balloon got popped today. And then he goes on to say, you can't impeach a president on obstruction charges when the special counsel admits that they applied a legal standard to the president that has never been applied to anyone in the history of American jurisprudence before, which is something that Bob Mueller admitted today. He said, I am not at all clear on what he thinks he's talking about. If you're keeping score at home, though, it says, Ratcliffe doesn't seem to have a problem with Russia's attacks on U.S. elections. He lied about Mueller's investigation. He doesn't care if the president obstructed justice, and he loves Fox News. Perfect. You might also recall that in 2016, I don't think I do, Ratcliffe challenged former FBI Director James Comey over the investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of private email servers and Comey's decision not to recommend criminal charges, another feather in Ratcliffe's MAGA cap. The news that Ratcliffe might replace Coates followed a report last Monday by Politico noting that Trump had met with Devin Nunes, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, to discuss replacing the current DNI. Nunes and Trump share a common fondness of attacking the U.S. intelligence community over its Russia investigations and accusing the Obama administration of wiretapping Trump's campaign officials. Apparently, so does Ratcliffe. Okay, so that's, I guess that's the conspiracy theory that Ratcliffe is a fan of, in addition to a penchant for saying, I don't know what, restating the obvious about the special counsel's charging documents and then saying, you know, and getting general agreement with them because it's true and obvious, and then sort of nodding his head at everybody and saying, see, everyone agrees with me, told you. And then, I don't know, just sort of plucking a conclusion out of thin air that he's somehow attacked the special counsel. I mean, maybe we ought not to be worried about it. Maybe he's going to end up as Director of National Intelligence anyway. I mean, and it is dangerous to have a moron in that job, a sycophantic moron at that, but maybe he has no legitimate idea what to do with his power, and I don't know. I mean, maybe he just always will just simply restate the obvious and then nod in agreement with himself. And if the Trumps love that, then maybe by itself, if that was all he did, I suppose he couldn't do any affirmative harm, but, you know, the harm that would be done to the United States national security by virtue of his even benign neglect of his duties as Director of National Intelligence would probably be irreversible, in the sense that, not that we can't work back diplomatically from embarrassment, but we'll all be killed. That part is hard to overcome. All right, there were other links that I was thinking of investigating. Let's see. There's an animated conspiracy theorist, Radcliffe, who has repeatedly and aggressively worked to promote Trump's own theory that the investigation was undertaken as a Democratic effort to undermine Trump. That's pretty self-explanatory. He alleged on Fox News that there were crimes committed by members of the Obama administration. I think that's the wiretapping conspiracy. And let's see. Trump was thrilled at watching Radcliffe, but let's see. Was widely discredited as being absurd and false premise to begin with. I guess that was the PolitiFact investigation. I wonder if they have any clearer grasp of what Radcliffe was trying to say here. The examination in PolitiFact was of his statement where he said that Robert Mueller didn't follow the special counsel regulations. It clearly says, write a confidential report about decisions reached. Nowhere in here does it say, write a report about decisions that were not reached. So, in other words, a guy who's having difficulty understanding that a decision about not filing charges against the president, and I guess what he's really saying is the idea that when you say your report didn't exonerate the president because it wasn't supposed to reach conclusions. I mean, that's why he doesn't exonerate the president, right? The president says you totally exonerated him. Did you? No, we didn't. We weren't supposed to reach a conclusion like that. Aha! Where does it say in your authorizing documents that you were not supposed to reach a conclusion? All over them? Ah, right. Exactly. Huh? What do you think? Huh? Did pretty good, right? He agrees with me. I mean, I don't know what to make of this. A look at whether Robert Mueller broke the rules for special counsels is the investigation written up, I guess, or the review written up by the PolitiFact people. John Greenberg, in this case. Let's see if he can get any closer to making heads or tails out of this. Texas Republican Radcliffe, blah, 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 delivered a sharp rebuke. You wrote 180 pages, he says, about potential crimes that were not charged or decided. Now, respectfully, by doing that, you managed to violate the most sacred of traditions of prosecutors, not offering extra prosecutorial analysis about potential crimes that are not charged. He's asking for crimes to be charged. I mean, that's very odd. I don't know why Trump was thrilled by this. You didn't follow the special counsel regulations. It clearly says, write a confidential report about decisions reached. Nowhere in here does it say to write a report about decisions that were not reached. A decision not to charge is a decision, right? It wasn't that it was not reached. The only decision that was not reached was the decision to charge him with a crime, and he didn't reach that conclusion because the OLC memo says you can't charge a sitting president with a crime. And he says, I mean, it's a bizarre, all it is a stupid word game that purports at least to misunderstand every word in it. You didn't follow your investigation is illegitimate because you didn't follow the regulations. It says, write a report about the decisions you reached. One of the decisions was a decision not to charge. Aha! That's not a decision not to charge, but a non-decision to charge. It kind of is, I guess, if you look at it that way. But, and so therefore, you're out of compliance with the special counsel regulations. You were supposed to decide whether or not to charge, and instead you not decided to charge. You made a non-decision about charging. No, we made a decision. We decided not to charge because the OLC memo says we can't. But where does it say that you're supposed to decide not to charge? You're supposed to decide to charge. You want me to charge the president with a crime? Yes, you do. I mean, no, totally not. Yes, which is what I said earlier, but I was just saying that to troll you. So it's pretty dumb semantics. You were supposed to come up with a decision to charge, not a non-decision on charging. But it was a decision. It was a bad one, but it was a decision. I don't know. Experts, of course, say Mueller followed the rules to the letter, which is, of course, what happened. Ratcliffe is making a pretty strained reading of the DOJ regulations. He's not even making that. He's making a strained reading of the conclusion that Mueller got to. I don't know. I mean, it might be giving him too much credit to say it's a strained reading of the DOJ regulations. Federal regulations say at the conclusion of the special counsel's work, he or she shall provide the Attorney General with a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions reached by the special counsel. It clearly includes declinations, which is taking no action. This is the expert here being cited as University of St. Thomas law professor Mark Osler. And, that's a pretty good bottom line of it too, right? Without getting into whether or not his semantics are stupid, it's just a plain misstatement of what the special counsel regulations say. Special counsel says, the regulations say, give us a report with prosecution or declination decisions. Well, here are some declination decisions. Aha! But you're not supposed to not conclude things. Well, I didn't. I concluded on everything. But you concluded that you shouldn't charge. Yeah, that's a declination. Right here where it says, or declination. Yeah, that's the part we're talking about. Oh. Well, that's embarrassing, but I'm not going to be in this job much longer, so it's okay. I'm going to become the Director of National Intelligence. Great. Ratcliffe also erred about the need to avoid extra prosecutorial analysis about potential crimes that are not charged, said Rick Simmons at Ohio State University College of Law. Mueller was offering evidence that could be used if the Attorney General did, in fact, decide to charge him, Simmons said. Not only is that not barred, it is precisely the kind of evidence that Mueller would be expected to bring to give proper advice to the Attorney General. Doubling down on that, don't use that term if you're talking about real stuff, though. But okay, this is doubling down on that. Sai Krishna Prakash, professor at the University of Virginia, said nothing in the American legal system precludes a prosecutor from commenting upon a case she investigated. So, yeah. All right, well, there's the basics for you. The ruling, Ratcliffe said Mueller overstepped the bounds for prosecutors by writing about potential crimes that were not charged. This is wrong. Federal regulations specifically require special prosecutors to explain their decisions not to prosecute. That explanation goes to the Attorney General, who then decides what to make public. We found no legal scholar, none, who agreed with Ratcliffe. We rate this claim false. That's an abrupt ending, considering that he's now up for Director of National Intelligence. I mean, it really needs to say more about precisely how stupid that is, but I guess you were never going to get that one. All right. I think we're done with that angle on things. And I thought I would take a look over at there were a number of other angles to work on off of this. But, I don't know if I am seeing them all laid out quite so simply in my strategic plan and pocket here. Oh, I did want to remind you that there was a technical difficulty with what might be Donald Trump's plan to have the Office of the Director of National Intelligence function in between the Coates resignation and the Ratcliffe confirmation, if that is in fact forthcoming. We don't know how long that's going to take. We don't know if he's actually filed the paperwork, etc. But the usual MO here is for him to name an acting Director of National Intelligence and pick someone by hand, or have someone hand him a pick to claim as his hand-picked successor. And we have here in front of us the tweet of Bobby Chesney, who is the James Baker, of all people, James Baker Chair and Associate Dean at the University of Texas School of Law, who has, and a co-founder of Lawfare blog, by the way, who has this helpful information for us. He says, the president does not get to pick an acting director of national intelligence. 50 U.S. Code 3026A6 provides that the principal deputy director, that's a position that is currently filled already, the principal deputy director, in this case, as he says, the wonderful Sue Gordon, about whom I know nothing, automatically serves in that capacity. See here a link to 50 U.S. Code Section 3026A6, which purportedly provides by law that the new acting director of national intelligence is Sue Gordon by virtue of her occupancy of the office of principal deputy director. However, and by the way, this is in direct response to a Trump tweet that says, in response to the Coates resignation, I'd like to thank Dan for his great service to our country, etc., blah, blah, blah. The acting director will be named shortly, which is to say he believes he has the opportunity to select whomever he wants. Chesney, the professor of law and co-founder of Lawfare blog, says, no, you don't get to pick. 50 U.S. Code Section 3026A6 says that the principal deputy director takes over. That's that. That's end of story. But it's never the end of the story. And lots of people were very quick, I'm proud of you all, to point out to him, LOL, YOLO, nothing matters. Tell me who's going to enforce that law. How, let's say he picks an acting director anyway. And we all point to 50 U.S. Code 3026A6, and he says, so what? What are you going to do about it? And we know how the story devolves from there. Nothing gets done about it. But, just thought I'd throw that one out there, and we'll see whether somehow that one sticks or something. And I don't know. We'll see if anything comes of it. All right. Let's see. There's much more. Many of them things that I feel like I'm pretty certain I put in pocket and they're just not there for some reason. But let's see. There are a few things that I thought I would share, and I'm going to have to find alternate methods of arriving at them. But I know I had something that I was interested in sharing from Sunday writing at Daily Kos, including Frank Vian Walton's piece, Left and Right Have More Than a Difference of Opinion. It's a difference of reality. We definitely wanted to get to that one. And there was something from Mark Sumner that I had an interest in sharing, and as I recall, I thought I had put that aside, and that it was at the top of the recommended list not long ago, and now I guess things have moved on from there. Let me see if I can't pick up that diary and at least mark it for sharing for tomorrow, since we're just about out of time. I hope we constructed a reasonably coherent program for you today, even though we didn't get into a lot of news items. But the overarching danger, I guess, of what's happening now in replacing the Director of National Intelligence, in remaking the intelligence community in his ridiculous, dotardly image, and the promotion of conspiracy theory over reality at all levels in the Republican Party should be troubling you and weighing heavily on your mind, as it is on mine. And we got the wrong music ready, but there's our correct music instead. It's been a disorienting day. Let's see if I can't find this thing real soon. If I do find it right away, I can tease you with a presentation of what's coming up, but no, it doesn't appear to be easily accessible for one reason or another, but I'll see if I can't find those things. Much more to share with you as the week goes on, of course, and we draw closer to the Democratic debate. We'll try and keep an eye on that for you. And you can always, of course, depend on the crew at Daily Kos to live tweet it to you or live cover it. Even if you're watching, you can watch alongside and commiserate. If you're not watching, you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on as it happens. And, wow, lots of other things to include in the upcoming week. And, of course, including the growing number of members of Congress signing on for beginning an impeachment inquiry or inquiring as to whether or not to begin an impeachment inquiry. However you want to put it, we can talk about that procedurally and what it means and how it's become the snap polls of 2019, disproving the pundits once again. Do stay tuned for what's coming up next on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam. He's got his own lineup here, and we'll dissect the weekend's happenings in the week ahead in his own way.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waltman.
Yes, a topic we should have spent some more time on and will likely spend some time on later in the week. Democratic activists and candidates who ignore Trump's racism are, quote, this is a great quote, bringing spreadsheets to a gunfight. And yeah, that's pretty much the way the weekend was spent as people were trying to logically debunk what he had to say about Baltimore. It has nothing to do with logic.